Okay, so I'm going to start the meeting if that's okay. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. Good evening and welcome to tonight's primary care seminar hosted by the Primary Care Education Department at City St George's, University of London. My name's Lucy Williams. I'm a GP and clinical lecturer here at City St George's, and I'm joined by members of our primary care team, Professor Judith Ibsen and Stephen Lupton, as well as our student partners, Rachel and Zara, who have supported developing and delivering this. So this seminar is the third of this year's primary care seminar series, which is in its third year now, aiming to showcase the diverse opportunities available to diverse opportunities available within primary care to both students and professionals. We've created these seminars alongside our students, medical students and students from other allied healthcare courses who've really been the driving force behind these events, and it's with their input and passion that we're able to explore a variety of topics within the field, highlighting the vast potential that a career in academic primary care can offer. So tonight's topic, chosen by our students, focuses on something that I'm sure will be of interest to lots of our students who may be very familiar with this resource, as well as clinicians who have other interests outside of patient-facing work. So I'm delighted to welcome tonight's speaker, Dr. Lewis Potter, who will be discussing his journey developing an online medical education platform, Geeky Medics, alongside his clinical training, as well as recent innovations in AI-augmented clinical education. Dr. Potter's a GP and founder of Geeky Medics, one of the most widely used medical education platforms in the UK and internationally. He founded the platform back in 2010 while still a medical student and has grown into a resource supporting over 1 million learners each month. He was awarded the British Empire Medal for his contributions to medical education and continues to combine clinical practice with innovation in digital learning. So Dr. Potter will speak on this for the next 40 minutes or so, and that will be followed by a Q&A. So please submit your questions into the Q&A box for any comments and questions. There isn't a chat enabled, so anything you want to say, comments or questions, please just submit there. So without further ado, I'll now hand over to Lewis.
Thank you, Lucy, for that lovely introduction. And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this evening, giving up precious time. So as Lucy described, I'm going to talk a little bit about my journey with Geeky Medics alongside clinical training. And hopefully that's useful for some of you who are maybe thinking about doing other things alongside your training as you progress. So I'm just going to share my slides. Okay. Does that look okay, Lucy?
Yeah, perfect. It's our presenter mode. Yeah.
Great. So a little bit about me briefly. You've heard lots about me already. So I live in Newcastle, and I was a Newcastle University graduate. So I graduated back in 2012, and I'm now a GP sometimes. So I'm going to take you back to the beginning of Geeky Medics, and then we're going to work through it fairly quickly, just to give you a bit of context, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges I faced trying to combine training with a side project, and how I've sort of learned to overcome those things over time. So this is probably a long time ago for some of you, which makes me feel quite old, but it was 2010 when I started working on Geeky Medics. So at that time, I was a fourth year medical student at Newcastle University, and I was a geek, so I was interested in tech and was looking for excuses to dabble with tech. I wasn't a developer, I was just really an enthusiast. And I'd already tried a few blogs and YouTube channels where I just blogged about, what I'd had for breakfast and what I was up to that week, but I didn't live a particularly interesting life. So there's no surprise that people weren't that interested. I also tried my hand at being a tech reviewer before the big names of today. And again, I wasn't particularly successful with that too. I couldn't handle the YouTube comments. So it was after several of these failed projects that I decided that podcasts might be the next big thing. So obviously, I'm sure you all probably, you know about podcasts and probably listen to them fairly regularly. But at this time in 2010, they were very, very new. So I was listening to what would be called podcasts via BitTorrent, because people would start recording, chatting with somebody else, but they couldn't afford the bandwidth to serve it to you. So they would use BitTorrent, and that's how you would get a hold of these podcasts. So a totally legitimate use of BitTorrent for once. And then Apple came along and decided that they would add these things, these audio chats to iTunes, and they would call them podcasts because the iPod at that point was pretty big. And that was an enormous moment for podcasts because, you know, it gave them this name that we all know today, but also it provided a distribution mechanism where you didn't need to be a big geek to, you know, to get a podcast and subscribe to it. You could just go click subscribe, just like you can today, and it would show up on your iPod. So I thought that this was the beginning of something big, and maybe I should try and get in on it. So I went and I registered geekymedics.com at that time and took a screenshot as well for some reason for the bargain price of £6.06. And the aim of Geeky Medics at that point was to be a podcast. So I thought I would do a podcast where I chatted with other nerdy medical students about what cool stuff was going on with tech at the time in the context of medicine and medical education. Because at that time, actually, there wasn't much chatter about that stuff, which is probably hard for you to believe at this point. And I convinced a friend to feature with me on the first episode. And we recorded it. It was a nice chat. And I listened to it on the way into university the next day, and it was just really, really, really hard to listen to. I realized I just wasn't going to be a podcaster. That wasn't a skill of mine. So I decided to scrap it there and then. It was that obviously terrible. So that was that, unfortunately. However, I had paid £6.06 for the domain name geekymedics.com. So I was thinking about other projects I could work on. And one thing that I was encountering at the time, I was trying to prep for my OSCEs, and there just wasn't a great deal of content available online at that time, which again, you'll struggle to believe now because there's tons of great resources everywhere. And I decided that I would maybe do like a website where I could put some of my notes and I could speak to some of the clinical skills teachers to see if they would help produce some resources. So I sketched out what the website would look like. And again, you can see that art is not my strong point. And my mum dug this out of a drawer a few years ago. And the idea initially was, let's just get a website online, which you might say, well, yeah, that's easy. You just subscribe to Wix and click a few buttons and AI will just make it for you. But actually at that point, it was you had to be pretty nerdy to get a website online. So I had to call a man at a place to rent a server. And then once I had the server, I had to figure out how to install blogging software onto the server. And at that time, there was this thing called WordPress that was pretty new. And it was a lot easier than what had come before it in terms of to install and use. So I decided to get WordPress installed on this server, which I managed to do over a few weeks. It took forever. And at that point, I had a server and I had a website. So when you typed in geekymedics.com, you got to this blog of mine. And I wasn't a developer, as I'd mentioned, so I relied heavily on the kind goodwill of people who were technical on the WordPress.com forums, where I would essentially beg for help when the website was broken and wasn't online. And people were really nice and offered advice without being paid to unblock me when I was stuck. And yeah, I mean, there were times when I spent a week trying to get a button just to, look correct or not fly off the screen for users. So it was a pretty buggy website, but it was a website. And what became apparent as soon as I got it online was, whilst I had some notes, so some text content, actually I had no graphics. And at the time, I couldn't afford to really license any images. I didn't even really fully understand, how it worked with copyright, and it all just made me a bit nervous. So I decided that I had this side hobby of mine of doing pixel art because I liked that art style of old school video games. So I decided I would create a few organs and bits of equipment in that style because I could do that despite not being able to do other types of proper art. And then if, the site got popular at all, then I would obviously swap that out for something that looked a bit more professional. But this ended up becoming a kind of key part of the brand almost by mistake, which I'm delighted about because I love the art style. So I had the art and I had the blog, and this was what the website looked like back in 2010. So again, luckily managed to get a screenshot. And at that time, the website was very buggy. And I think I spent a week trying to get those blue squares to line up and eventually gave up. And but it worked. So it had my notes on there on the conditions I was covering at the time, and they weren't particularly amazing notes or anything, but they were there. And really, what had driven that was I was sat in the lecture theatre watching everybody write notes, and I was thinking, this feels so wasteful. Like, we're creating 300 copies of notes for this lecture, and if one of us just we all kind of contribute this together, we could have a whole compendium of resources quite quickly. So that was the initial idea behind the site. So I had some articles on conditions like Cushing syndrome or glomerulonephritis, etc. And then I wanted to create some OSCE guides because that was the original idea that I'd started this with. So I, again, with the help of some clinical skills teachers, put together a few guides, and these were just text-based. And what became apparent again really quickly was that images were going to be important. And more importantly, a video demonstration would be really handy. And at that time, I had gone looking for video examples of clinical skills online. And me and my friends had found one resource that I forget the name of now, but it was a paid resource and it was expensive. And when you did pay for it, you had like something silly like 30 minutes per video. And once you'd used up that amount of viewing, you were locked back out and you had to pay again. So I decided that actually probably we could shoot our own videos because I had an interest in video production at school. I did GCSE in drama, and I was pretty terrible at acting. And the drama teacher one day sort of offered me the opportunity to be the co-director with him, which I think was his way of trying to get me off the stage. And as part of that one night, I went and we were recording the drama club doing a particular production. And he brought this older guy in who was a video editor. And this was with tape-based media at the time. So I got to spend a few hours with him with this fancy computer, and he was editing the video. And I fell in love with that idea of video editing and got really into it. So I since then been quite into video related production stuff and was fairly handy with video editing software and that kind of stuff. So I decided I'm going to save up I had some money saved up from a job that I was doing on the weekends, and I decided to buy a camera and a mic and then convince some friends to shoot some initial videos with me. So this was Andrew Pugh and Colin Brewster, and they were both fellow course mates with me at Newcastle. And the kind of pitch to them was that I wanted to create a cardio and respiratory exam demonstration for an OSCE in which each of them would get to play the doctor and each of them would get to play the patient. So we would sort of swap for the two. But it was a big ask at that time because there was a lot of fear in medical education at institutions, at universities, that YouTube, which is where I was planning on hosting these videos because I couldn't afford to host them myself, was very unprofessional, and it was just for cat videos and wasn't, a legitimate place that, medical education really is occurring or should be occurring. So they were pretty nervous, and I was, that we would get in trouble for shooting these videos. And, they had their tops off. So again, it was all a bit fraught. But they took a bit of a leap of faith and decided that they would do this with me, which I'm really thankful for, because thinking back, it was quite a big ask. So we recorded the first two videos at a clinical skills lab in Middlesbrough, actually, where I knew the clinical skills team. And we recorded the cardio and respiratory exams. I spent a few weeks editing them, and then I released them on YouTube. So just as geekymedics.com is today, I had the video on YouTube, and then I embedded it into the OSCE guide. And I thought, you know what, these videos, actually, they're free for one. They're in HD, which was a brand new thing at the time. And I thought I'd done a pretty good job. So I expected I would upload them and then people would just come along and watch them and all would be well. But actually that wasn't what happened at all. So nobody was watching the videos. So weeks and weeks went past with 0 views, or 5 views, 6 views, but that was just me checking it. And I think my mum, gave me a view. And at that point, I decided I needed to do something called marketing, which is not a strong point of mine, still remains the case. So I did the most introverted marketing you can do, where you go to medical student forums and tell people about your thing. So I went to a few of these forums, and that's an original post there saying, I've got this website, check it out. And again, nobody replied for weeks. And then one person eventually did reply and sort of apologized for the lack of everyone else's interest. So it was a bit of a pity reply. But they did say that they would help spreading that word. So I was hopeful that, that word would spread at some point. So essentially what happened from there was I kept shooting new videos and putting new articles on the website and making it less buggy. In part, I didn't really care that much that people weren't watching, because it was just a really fun project to get to play with, get to learn more about video production and how YouTube worked and how websites worked and how graphic design worked. It was just a really fun sort of combination of all these little interests that I had in one place. And then slowly but surely, over the following year or two, it started to pick up steam. And I can only kind of explain this by word of mouth spreading, because it wasn't anything to do with my marketing skills. And I think we started to rank better in Google. So if you went and searched for cardiovascular exam, we would show up, and things started to snowball from there, and the word spread. So this gives you a sense of sort of the traffic to geekymedics.com. So, you can't really see a bar in 2010, but things were slow at first, but then they did really start to pick up pace. And they picked up pace right around the time I was starting foundation. So I was in the real thick of foundation full time, trying to figure out how to be a doctor. And then also the website was going down because the server was overloaded, and people were emailing because, it was down, and they were angry, and they kind of thought that it was more of a company than just me. And I remember, being on night shifts and replying to people saying, this is just my Gmail, I'm at work, I'm sorry, I'll try and sort it out tomorrow. So it was quite a stressful time in that period of growth. And really, I've continued to do the same thing ever since. So, it's 15 years now since I started Geeky Medics, which is hard to believe. And I am just as excited about it today as I was then, which I really wouldn't have expected. There are not many things in my life that, that has remained the case over 15 years. And I think a lot of why that, has continued is because there's this amazing community of users who come and use the resources, offer feedback, contribute to Geeky Medics, and use the resources in all these settings that I would have never imagined. So, we are truly global in that sense. Wherever there is English-speaking students, and even where there are not, our resources are often referred to and used. So some examples there, that binder in the middle was some students in India who emailed and said, do you mind, we've printed out your website, essentially, and because the Wi-Fi is terrible at the medical school, is this okay? Which I was like, this is cool, amazing. I felt like they could have at least, included my name on the front of the book, but I, have since learned that actually binding a book is quite a challenging thing. So maybe that was fair enough. And that was a professor, that screenshot at the top right was a professor in Japan who was doing some translations for us. And, all sorts of other places, South Korea, Mumbai, etc. So amazing, way beyond what I expected this to be. And as I sort of alluded to, during that initial takeoff point of Geeky Medics, I was in the mix of foundation. So these were my rotations at that time. So it was a challenging time, apart from when I was an anatomy demonstrator, because that was summer. So that was the nice end of the foundation program. And in the midst of this madness, I really, really struggled to balance training, being at work, and trying to do this thing on the side. And I had no training, or I didn't know anyone else who was doing something similar. So I didn't really have any peers to speak to about it. And I was just failing on so many different facets of the project. So a lot of this obviously was, my leadership struggles were driven by limited time outside of a full-time job. So anyone who's done the foundation program would understand there's not a great ton of time outside of the job. And what compounded the problem was that I didn't really understand how to delegate any tasks. So people would offer to help all the time. And I would, on occasion, bring someone in and say, yeah, could you help like me try and edit this like backlog of Word documents that people have submitted, or, you know, topic summaries, etc., quizzes. And people would submit, you know, a Word document that had 50 quiz questions in it. And then I had to kind of try and extract those into this buggy website to make it look like a quiz. So all of this stuff would take forever. I remember spending, you know, 6-7 hours trying to convert one person's article into a decent article on the website. And that was all to do with, you know, I didn't have any systems or guidelines for people submitting stuff. So people would just submit whatever they wanted, which was no fault of their own because I'd not provided any you know, guardrails. And then again, I tried to bring people on to help, but didn't explain really what I expected. And again, didn't provide them with any kind of system or guidance. So they would inevitably, you know, edit something in a way that I didn't want editing, or do something in the way that I didn't want it doing. No, again, no fault of their own, just my failure to actually be clear on what I wanted. So I ended up in this spiral of trying to get help not working out because of my own failure to, you know, lead and manage, and then saying, oh, you know what, it's just easier if I do this myself, which of course doesn't scale. So I spent several years in that kind of status whilst I was working. And then on top of that, I had a poor understanding of multiple areas of, you know, projects and business because I had no formal training in this. And there wasn't the resources that there are today around, you know, the term side hustle or, you know, running a project, etc. There was just none of that. So I didn't understand things like copyright, you know, as deeply as I should have, or accounting, you know. So our YouTube channel started to generate a little bit of money, and I'm talking like, you know, £100 a month. And I just assumed that was all fine and dandy, and, you know, YouTube, you know, the tax was all dealt with, you know, and then obviously came to learn that wasn't the case when I spoke to an accountant after a while. So there were just like so many parts of running a project that I really had no clue, and I was trying to figure out and learn on the fly on top of a full-time job in the foundation. And on top of all of that, we were trying to, like with Geeky Medics, I was trying to do all sorts of things. So we had medicine articles, surgical articles, clinical cases, quizzes, you know, OSCE videos. And really, we were doing lots of those things not particularly well. The OSCE stuff, I felt like we were doing well, but all these other things, less so. So we would just try to do way too many things given the size of the team. And there's a good phrase that I quite like where people talk about or ask, you know, are you working in the project or on the project? Because they're quite different things. So often when you're busy and overwhelmed, what you kind of default to is working in the project, where you think, okay, what's next on my task list? You know, what's next in the email inbox? And you're just like firefighting, taking one step in front of the other, and never really looking up and thinking, where am I going with this? What are the needs going to be in 6 months' time? How does this scale? So you end up in that loop I described, where you're just kind of firefighting on your own, totally burnt out. And that overall is not good for growing any kind of project. So I was pretty burnt out by the time I finished the foundation program, and that's why I decided to locum. So I moved into the locum life at that point, which was better than it is at the moment. So there was loads of locum work at that time. So it was pretty flexible. You could kind of get work when you wanted it, and then not do work for a bit. And the rates were pretty decent as well. So I decided I would locum bizarrely in neurosurgery because I'd done that in F2 and there was a rotation and I quite liked the ward despite having no real interest in, you know, becoming a neurosurgeon. What I would do was work for sort of 3 months full-time locum, and then I would take a month off where I would rent a desk at a local co-working space in Newcastle. And there were lots of, you know, successful companies in there. It was all very exciting for me to finally have this sort of network of people who were running projects that I hadn't had previously. But of course, Geeky Medics wasn't really generating any money, so it certainly wasn't profitable. It was loss making, especially if I factored in my time. So the pattern was I'd work for 3 months, save up some money, and then live off that money for the next 4 to 6 weeks. And then once I ran out of money, I would go back and locum again. So in those periods where I was purely working on Geeky Medics, I would try and, you know, film as many videos as I could, edit as many videos as I could, you know, improve the website, all of this stuff. So it was actually a great time, and it was a real contrast to the first 2 years in foundation. And this is where, speaking to other people who'd run projects, I started to learn about, how to create systems and guidelines and how to bring somebody on in a way that they understand their role and they are kind of empowered to succeed. So things started to get a bit better. I'm not saying that I had everything together at that point. I absolutely didn't, and still don't know to some degree. It's a constant learning process. And then what happened was I decided in 2015 was that I would do the Australia thing. So everyone was going to Australia to work as a doctor. And I thought that would be pretty cool. And I thought maybe that's where I wanted to be, having never been. So I decided to go work out there in Cairns, which is in Queensland. So it's kind of where the rainforest meets the Great Barrier Reef. So it's pretty humid and hot. And that was the the view out of the ward window when I was on my on call one day. And this was an amazing experience because it was totally different medicine than what I'd been used to. It was all tropical diseases, giant millipede bites. I was working in ED and then also a bit on surgery. So it was really brilliant. However, at that time, I was also having to balance working on Geeky Medics. So I was full-time in ED in Australia, obviously terrible time zone difference to the UK where most of our usage was. So I was dealing with, all of the problems that come with running Geeky Medics were still there, whilst also working a lot of hours in A&E in Australia. So it was quite challenging. And I was having these big, decisions in my head about, do I stay in Australia? Maybe do I train in emergency medicine? Because that's what some of my friends were doing. So I quit medical training altogether and just focused on Geeky Medics in the UK. But again, it wasn't really self-sustaining. I couldn't exactly cover my own costs by working on it at that time. And then the other option in my head was, do I sort of apply to GP training, maybe full-time in the UK, and then focus on Geeky Medics once I'm done with the training? So I really wasn't sure about this, and I spent many nights sort of pondering it. And it was on one of these nights that I just happened to stumble across a blog post on some website about something called the NHS Clinical Entrepreneur Fellowship. And I thought, what is this? I sort of read into it and realized that they were basically trying to stop doctors from leaving training by allowing them, more flexible training, maybe where they can go less than full time. Because at that time, to go less than full time was a lot more difficult. You kind of needed medical reasons or care responsibility reasons. And it was, I'd asked before and there wasn't really a lot of appetite because they were like, what, you want to go 60% so you can sit in your pajamas and work on your computer for 2 days a week. So this program kind of offered me the opportunity to legitimize that I was working on something worthy and that maybe I would be able to get less than full-time GP training. The catch was that the deadline had already passed. This was the first cohort of the program, and I couldn't believe it. So this was in December. So I sent this email. I remember sending it at some ungodly hour, and from Australia, saying, "Hey, like I've been working on this thing for several years, and I feel like this program would be perfect for me, but the deadline's passed. I'm really sorry. Maybe please could I still have an interview?" So it was a pretty desperate email. But they did thankfully reply and said, sure, if you can come to the UK for the interview dates, then we'll interview you. So I went back to the UK for the interview and I got into the program. So as part of that, I decided to come back from Australia. So it did work. It brought me back from Australia and apply for GP training 60% less than full time, whilst also having this clinical entrepreneur program that some of you may well have heard of or be part of. So it's pretty big now. They have really large cohorts. I think the initial cohort was like 15 people. So it was really small. And in case you're wondering, they don't give you any money, but what they do is give you sort of workshops and pit stops every 4 to 6 weeks where you go and meet with other people on the program and they have mentors. So it's really helpful for figuring out all those things I mentioned that I had no clue about. So it was a great program for me. And I'm still really part of it to this point. I'm speaking at an event in a few months there. So then my path in GP training from that point onwards was that I was 60%, so essentially 3 days a week equivalent in GP training, and then 2 days a week on Geeky Medics. So it was a really fun time. starting this new training program, rotating through all of these specialties, so, GP, obs and gynae, peds, geriatrics, acute stroke, in my first phase of training, and then also working on Geeky Medics 2 days a week. And it felt so special to have these dedicated days just to work on Geeky Medics. And even though, it wasn't generating enough for me to cover any of my own costs, I could sort of just about get by with the 3 days a week and, the occasional locum shift. And then I decided in 2019 to go back to Australia because my now wife wanted to go and do the Australia thing and work in ED. So I went out with her, but I decided that I would just work full time on Geeky Medics. So Geeky Medics just at that point was at the point where I thought I probably could get by if I, really cut the expenses of Geeky Medics. I could pay myself enough to survive in Australia on a working holiday visa whilst my partner was working, and I would just really focus full time on Geeky Medics at a co-working space, which is what I did. So that was brilliant because I was just, heading to this cool co-working space in Melbourne. My wife was heading for a run of 5 night shifts in ED. That was pretty bitter. So it was much better for me. And then when I returned, so that I got a year out of GP training for that, they granted me a year, what they call time out of training, or TOOT. And I returned to GP training exactly a year later, and resumed kind of where I'd stopped. So I did more hospital placements, and then I thought, you know what, there's this opportunity to do an integrated training post where I get to get my postgraduate certificate in education, and I get to teach at a medical school. I'll do that, even though that will extend my training even further. So my training, as you can see there, was pretty long for GP training. So it ended up being about seven years of training to get to the end rather than the usual 3. But I have no regrets because it was brilliant. And I was managed to, build Geeky Medics alongside my training rather than having one or the other, still get to CCT. So life in GP training was the most challenging part of it was the context switching. So, on Monday, I would be the CEO of Geeky Medics. And then Tuesday, I would be teaching as a teacher at the local medical school for clinical skills. And then I'd be in GP as a GP trainee. And then, I'd be Geeky Medics again. So it was pretty intense, probably one of the most intense periods of my life in terms of workload, because I was still putting a lot of hours in on Geeky Medics. But things, finishing training, things have gotten better. So now I have the flex to be able to locum in GP and do shifts in GP. My plan is to have a salary job in GP, but at the moment, there are not lots of salary jobs for, very part-time type work around something else and working on that. So in terms of where Geeky Medics is now, we see around 5 million views of our content every month. We have almost 500,000 registered users in our app. 1.5 million subscribers on YouTube almost, I think we're pretty much there. And we have about 10 years worth of footage watched every month on YouTube in terms of minutes watched, which I always find a bit mind-boggling. And now there's enough revenue in the company that I can support myself and several employees and also a lot of individual contributors. So we have a small pool of employees. There is me, Chris, Jamie, Grace, and then Jake, who's just joined us now. And then a larger team of individual contractors, or maybe medical students or doctors who will, write a single question or a single article and be paid for that, but they won't have any regular work with us. So in terms of where things are going now, I'll talk a little bit about the future and then also cover some tips for anyone who's working on their own project. So right at the moment, really the focus has been on growing our team, which we've been doing a good job of that within reason, of course. And we are fully asynchronous, so we don't largely rely on calls or being live with each other. It's largely all done by DM, and we're all fully remote, so it's quite flexible. And the team, other than our developer, are all doctors too, so that's really nice. And really, we're focusing on expanding the breadth of our video content. So I've filmed lots of videos, and I still do all the filming and all the editing largely. And also building tools that educators can use to educate, their students. And of course, as I'm sure you're all very familiar with, there has been huge shifts in AI over the last few years. So I did my postgraduate certificate that I mentioned in GP training on the use of simulated patients. And it was great timing because it was when all of this stuff started to happen. So it was very apparent to me that this was a really significant shift, and it could really change the way that we train and practice. So of course I'm referring to the LLM. So that's what ChatGPT is, and several other of these chatbots, a large language model. And I genuinely think that this is the most significant advance since the computer or the internet. And I think what is particularly interesting about large language models is all they do is predict using very large data sets what is the likely next letter or word based on what's come before and what has been asked. And it turns out that allows it to generate language that sounds very genuine. And I think we thought that language was a lot more special and was going to be a harder nut to crack than it turns out to have been. So I'm sure that all of you interacted with this point at AI, whether you know it or not. But really, the ability of LLMs to understand language and produce language, regardless of the spoken language of the content, that doesn't really seem to matter. It's just really an amazing thing that just wasn't possible before. So previously, we essentially as humans were having to do a lot of conversion of, I want this thing, but I can't just say I want this thing because you as the computer won't understand. So let me turn that into this, pseudo in-between language that the computer understands. And what's happened now is that has gone away. You can speak to the computer and to technology just as you would another human, and it can speak back to you in the same way. So that's an enormous fundamental change. And whilst, at the moment things are amazing and progressing rapidly, we are still very, very early with this stuff. And yeah, probably, things are going to get weird. Things are already getting weird. And I think they'll only get weirder. So as I mentioned, my dissertation was in the use of simulating patients. So 3 years ago, we launched our virtual patient product on Geeky Medics. And the aim was to take our existing scenarios and allow students, when they didn't have anyone else to practice with, to talk with an AI patient. And of course, this is, again, quite a fundamental shift, because for the longest time, if you wanted to practice communication skills, you always had to have a willing human participant. So if it was 9 p.m. at night and you wanted to practice taking a chest pain history, you were kind of out of luck if there was no one around. I remember trying to, convince my mum to do a chest pain history for the second time just because I wanted to practice again. And it's a big ask to ask someone to do this whole same scenario again. So as a result, often you just couldn't repeatedly practice this stuff. Whereas, with knowledge, you might hammer a question bank again and again and again, and there's no guilt because the question bank, doesn't have feelings. So I think with virtual patient, the real benefit I saw was this ability to practice wherever you are in a safe space where you're not worried about the judgment of the classic communication skills day where you get 1 day to learn cardiovascular history and you've got to do it in front of the patient actor and maybe several of your peers, and it's all quite high pressure and you don't get that long to practice it. So I think it's certainly not a replacement for everything that we already do in medical school, but it is a really nice addition that can, help before a session, after a session, to revise. And initially we launched this, it was just text-based because that's all that was really possible at the time. And it got slowly better, and initially it wasn't great, and it's got better and better and better over time. And we've had over 500,000 consultations with our virtual patients at this point, to give you some sense of scale and what we've seen. And then as the technology has progressed, we could suddenly do audio-based consultations where you could speak and the AI could speak back, and you could have a more natural sounding conversation, in any language that you wanted. So I'll try and play this here, and let's see. Hi, I'm Dr. Potter. Can I just start by checking your name and date of birth, please?
Sure. It's Sarah Bennett, 12th of May, 1991.
Nice to meet you, Sarah. And how can I help today?
It's my tummy. It just hurts so much.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. When did that start?
It came on suddenly about 1.5 hours ago.
So you get the idea that you can have this audio consultation. And now we're at a point where video is becoming possible. So now what we can do is generate a video in real time, second by second, with the audio, so that it almost feels like you're on a Zoom call with a virtual patient. So I'll give you a demonstration of...
Got this high fever that started about 4 days ago, and it just feels awful, like I'm burning up and can't get cool again.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Have you ever experienced anything like this before?
No, nothing like this before. It just came on slowly and has been getting worse since then.
So you can see there that obviously there's still this uncanny valley. It's not perfect. I'm not professing it is. But the trajectory that we're on, I have no doubt that we will be at a point where we have AI avatars like this that are indistinguishable almost from real humans. And there's obviously there are all sorts of, concerns around that and how these things will be used. But thinking about this purely in an educational communication skills context, it's actually super, super valuable to be able to practice with these AI avatars. Before you do a real session, maybe you want to practice something like sexual history taking and you've never done that before, and you want to kind of get a sense of what it feels like to ask those intimate questions and how the patient might respond in a sort of safe environment before you go and do that for real. And we already accept that as the appropriate way to do things when we talk about putting in an IV cannula, that, you practice on the plastic arm first. Then, when you're considered competent at that, you can try on a real human. And I think with communication skills, we've never had the equivalent of the plastic arm for communication skills. We've had real human actors, but that is quite an intimidating step for a lot of people. And I remember it was for me. So I think this potentially is a nice onboarding ramp to, high fidelity simulation. And with these consultations, you also can have a virtual examiner. So, what normally would require you and two friends to play the roles of examiner and patient, you can just do on your own. So the virtual examiner observes your consultation and then gives you feedback. And again, it's not perfect, but to get immediate personalized feedback is really valuable, even if it's not as good as it would be if you had, your lecturer, your medical school providing you feedback. So yeah, so that just gives you a little bit of a sample of the things that I'm working on at the moment and the kind of my areas of interest. So I'm nearly done. So I want to mention portfolio career as a term because I hear it a lot, and it's mentioned a lot in GP because a lot of GPs do have portfolio careers. And I think that if you have the opportunity and you're interested, it's a fantastic path to follow. So I think the advantage of portfolio careers are that you can sort of swap them out as and when needed. So, you might have a year as a GP where you have a special interest in diabetes and you're going to do some special clinics on that, or maybe assist in secondary care. And then you might also want to do a bit of medical education. Maybe you're involved in a local technology group. And then the next year, you might want to swap one of those pieces out for something else. So it's great of just keep having this variety and flexibility. And what also is nice is that as you dabble in different areas, which is kind of what I've always done, as I'm not particularly incredible at anything, but I'm, average to good at quite a lot of things. And what that means is that you have all these different areas of a Venn diagram that you have some interest and knowledge of. You start to see these really interesting opportunities at the points these fields intersect. So for me, medicine, AI, teaching, video production, all of these things coalesce and, you get an AI virtual patient avatar. So I think if you dabble in these different areas, you're quite well positioned to identify problems and then think about potential solutions to those problems. And, people who only know AI are not going to think about the context of a video avatar in communication skills because that's just areas they don't know about. They're just focusing on AI. And the same for medicine or teaching. But the magic, I think, happens when you have a few of these interests that you dabble in. And one other thing to say is that I think portfolio career is always mentioned as something that, you can do once you're finished with your training. But as I've demonstrated in my career path, you can have, less than full time where you integrate with, an educational qualification or some other role. So you don't need to necessarily wait until you qualify to do that, with the understanding it might well prolong your training, which I don't think is a bad thing. And then finally, if you are thinking about starting your own thing, then a few words of wisdom from me. I wish I'd sort of known earlier. So first of all, make sure you've identified a real problem. So I think a lot of people identify solutions and then start looking for a problem the solution will solve, which is a bad way to do things. So it's fun to dabble with things like that. And people, when you show them, your solution that's in search of a problem, they'll go, that's cool. But what I will tell you is that doesn't mean that they will use it. So you need to think about what are actual problems that people are facing day to day. And those are the things that if you create a solution to, people will use it. And people sometimes talk about painkillers versus vitamins, and that if people have a true pain, they will find, the paracetamol, they will find the painkiller. But if there's a vitamin that they could take that might in the long term be good for them, but it's not really something that's causing a problem day to day, they often won't get around to doing it. And again, leaning into your unfair advantages is really important. So thinking about what are your hobbies and interests, what little things do you know, or what organizations you're involved with, where you might have a bit of an unfair advantage over somebody else. So for me, that was, I had interest in video, in tech, and then I was also into medical education. So I had these multiple interests that allowed me to have an unfair advantage in creating a solution that involved them all. And focusing on a niche market is quite important. Sorry, my dog is barking. He's a very noisy puppy. So a niche market means a small group of people that you understand quite well. So in my world, it was fourth year medical students at Newcastle University. I really understood them, knew what they wanted, knew what they didn't want. And then I was able to develop something that was actually really tailored to their needs. And it's one of these odd situations where you can actually outcompete big companies really easily, because they, as they grow, start to look to bigger and bigger audiences, and therefore they become less and less focused on any one individual audience. So they neglect them to some degree. Whereas if you come in and you say, you know what, I know third year medical students need this one thing, and I'm going to do that one thing really well, you often will build a better solution. And then from that starting point, you can expand out and grow. And finally, make sure founder product and founder market fit mean make sure that you care about the product and are interested in what you're building. Because if you're not, it's going to be a slog. There were many, many years where no one had really any interest in what I was doing, but I just kept doing it even though nobody was watching, because I enjoyed it genuinely. And founder market fit means kind of a similar thing, but the people for which you're building the thing for, ideally you would know them, understand them, and like them. Because again, there's going to be periods of time where you just want to give up and stop because things aren't working. But at least if you like the people that you're serving and the product that you're building, you can kind of keep going. And it's like my friends who love running. They genuinely love running. And I just will never, ever be able to run like they can. I just will stop because I do not enjoy it. So it's very similar with this. I've gone 15 years and I'm still enjoying it because fundamentally I'm interested in it. So I think that's probably everything. Sorry if we've gone a little bit over time, but I'm happy to answer any questions. And I hope that was helpful to give you a bit of context of my journey and many of the mistakes I've made along the way.
Thank you so much, Lewis. Yeah, really, really fascinating to kind of hear it right from the beginning, from the concept and all the bits along the way. We've had some really nice questions. I thought one that sort of led straight into that was from Joseph Simmons, who was talking about, I guess, scaling. So you mentioned employees. I imagine it was a while before you had proper full-time employees, but at what time did you start making use of paid workers? So be that formal contractors or informal arrangements with students, and to what degree?
Yeah, so I was quite late on that because of this failure to sort of delegate, and obviously the issue of not really having the funds for a while. So it was probably when I started locuming that I had a little bit more income, and I decided to hire some help and that was initially help with like some graphics to improve on my graphics that weren't that good, and help with editing and content contributions and review by consultants, etc. And again, they weren't hugely in retrospect, a lot of them weren't that interested in money. They were more interested in some recognition and a certificate. So for the longest time, the currency was things like a PDF certificate. I spent ages making them, but they linked with a QR code back to the article, and then I would give an annual update on the stats of the article just manually by emailing the people. And then, so it was probably around 5 or so years in that I started to hire contractors and actually employees. I didn't have employees until 2 years ago, and I hired Chris, who was his GP trainee, and he was an editor as a contractor for a year or two, and then wanted some more regular work, and I knew he was good. So it's actually only recently that I've got employees. So in the last 2 years, we've gone from 0 employees and just casual contractors to 4 employees and me. Yeah.
Out of interest, in 2014-15, you were talking about those people sort of helping with some of the graphics and videos and things. Were they, and you were paying them, I guess, in academic prestige, if that makes sense, for their portfolios, but were they medics as well, or were they anyone non-medical, out of interest?
So the graphics and stuff, those were non-medical. So those skills that I use platforms like Fiverr, which was a good platform for this, because at that time you used to pay a $5 for tasks, so it was pretty cheap. That it's still called Fiverr, but you will not. There's nothing for a $5 on there. And another platform called Upwork, which again is a freelancer platform. So those are really helpful because you can often get people to do a singular task where you can control the cost and know exactly how much you're going to spend without having to understand all the ins and outs of employment law. And obviously with employment, the big thing for me was I was scared of taking the responsibility of someone saying, well, I'm going to leave this role and then suddenly be dependent on you, because it's a lot of responsibility obviously as an employer to do that. But actually in the context of medicine, as you know, like a lot of people are they're doing their job and their training anyway. So there's very few people who come to me and say, I want a full-time job. Most of them actually want some contract casual stuff that is totally flexible from their behalf. So that's worked quite well for us and allowed us to have really good medics work with us, but them still, be full-time or 80%. Or one of our employees at the minute is an anaesthetic trainee, and he worked with us full-time for a year, but now he's gone 80% anaesthetics, and then there's 1 day a week with us. Yeah, so it's still quite hard to find medics who would ever, work full-time on it. So.
You were saying about some of your tips, and you were saying about like finding a niche market. I really like that. Obviously, you were at Newcastle Uni. You knew the student body, as well as anyone there. So, I think Zara's question sort of links to this. She said, "How did your university eventually respond to the videos? Did they think the videos were unprofessional, as you had worried earlier? How is the reception there?"
Yeah, so it was a slow burn, I would say. I was nervous for several years, if I'm honest. So at medical school, the clinical skills teachers obviously knew because they were, aware of it, but I didn't go around shouting about it. And I remember distinctly being in foundation and mentioning to my first consultant about this. I've got this thing called Geeky Medics and there's some videos and stuff. And I remember distinctly being in the doctor's office and looking at it, being like, why are you doing this? This is just a distraction from training. And I was like, oh, no, I'm focused on training. And then I kind of kept quiet about it. And then it was only probably after F2 that I think it started to be used. I think what has actually happened is that the people who were at med school with me are now the consultants of today. So they have become, the senior people in the room, and therefore it's become more normalized. But I think it's purely like a passage of time thing. But yeah, it was a slow burn.
We've got time for a couple more questions. So from Katie, what gaps do you see? Obviously, you've talked a lot about AI and LLMs in the future, but any other gaps that, aside from that, or I guess alongside that you see in medical education market at the moment?
So I think what's going to become ever more important, and it does relate to AI, but it's not an AI thing, is that sort of human curation, quality control, trust, sources, all of these things that have always been quite important, actually in a world where content can be generated at any moment for essentially free. What's going to really matter there is that sort of layer of curation and reliability and providing these sources. And I think that's increasingly where there's going to be opportunity to sort of leverage some of these tools but also give the busy clinician, the busy medical student, a way of not having to wade through all of this and have somewhere they would trust. So I think there's tons of opportunities across that space. And when I think about when I started Geeky Medics, how long it took me to do all of these things that today, AI can spin up a website, in a few minutes, and it can generate some graphics for you in a few minutes. So I think more than ever, the only real barrier is kind of your ideas, like what you want to do. And, you don't even necessarily need a technical person to help you at this point. At some point you might, but I think if I was a medical student or like a medic today, I would be experimenting, because it's so quick and easy to experiment now. It doesn't have to be the final thing, but you can just play with these things because the cost and the time investment is just a fraction of what it was. So I think it's a really exciting time, actually. I've never been more unsure of the future, though, I will say that.
Yeah, I think this links, Sanjay was asking about, I think they're interested in building education tech, especially with AI now being such a big part of platforms like yours. And they were wondering about, like, would you advise learning about the heavy computing side early on yourself or outsourcing it? I guess from what you said, actually have a go by the sound of it and use AI to your advantage. That's what I've kind of just, even
Yes.
I'm not at all tech related, but you'd be surprised what Copilot can suddenly get you doing.
I think what you need to get really good at are explaining your ideas clearly in a structured format. And that is where you get a lot out of AI. So if it's like garbage in, garbage out. If you just give it a prompt that isn't clear, they've got better at taking unclear prompts and giving you valuable stuff back. But if you can write really clear, so this all comes down to communication skills. So for me, having spent 15 years writing specifications for technical people to then implement a feature, ultimately now what I can do is do the same thing with AI, but it got me really good at spending the time to write a really clear plan first. And I could do that collaboratively with an AI, and then I take that plan and give that to another AI to build. So I think I wouldn't say go do a PhD in computer science. I mean, there is a lot of demand for that if you want to work in the deep research, but if you want to be building things using this tooling, you don't need to know the underpinning, how it works necessarily. You need to learn how to use it as a tool, just like people had to learn how to use Google back in the day. It's very similar in my mind.
Last one, probably. Actually, a quick comment, sorry, from Chandran was just saying, well done, the videos are excellent resource. The virtual patient could also work very well in a PBL format using a branch scenario, allowing learners to choose options and learn from mistakes in a safe environment. So yeah, I'm sure that's something.
Sure.
Yeah, definitely.
Sure.
I was just going to ask very quickly, you talked a lot about the challenges previously before you were thinking about before the clinical entrepreneurship you did.
Sure.
So in terms of like finances, marketing, project management, stuff you hadn't really had a formal education in. What are your biggest, now you've kind of got that experience, what do you see as your biggest challenges currently, aside from the uncertainty of AI and things like that?
Yeah, so still like time is an issue, but my biggest weak points actually remain sort of marketing, sales, because it's not something natural within me. I don't enjoy it, and I feel it's just a bit, it's just not, doesn't come natural. It feels like a lot of effort and very draining. And as the CEO, kind of that is ideally what you would be, that person. Whereas I'm still really sort of the builder, where I quite like a quiet room where I just get to build the things and then give them to the audience, and not talk about the bells and whistles or try and force people to use it. Just build cool stuff and they use it. But that's, as my role now, I feel like I need to step up and be that more managerial person. And that makes me a little bit sad, because I feel like I'm getting further away from the things that I really enjoy, which are, building the things and doing a silly bit of pixel art or editing the video. So for me, it's that kind of figuring out, is this what I want, is to keep growing in that way, or maybe I want someone else to come and help do those things, and I get to keep doing the things I love. So that's kind of where I'm at in my head at the moment, speaking honestly.
Yeah, no, super interesting. Thanks for, very honest answers. I'm going to draw the Q&A to a close, if that's okay, and just hopefully share a screen. I don't know if I'm actually doing that. Yes, I am, with a QR code. So just a massive thank you to Lewis for today. I'm sure you all found that absolutely fascinating, and we would really welcome your feedback as we sort of continue to develop the series. So please use this QR code on the slide to complete the feedback, and it will also give you a link to and a certificate for attendance as well if you complete that at the end. We really look forward to seeing you again, hopefully next year, 2026, on Tuesday the 13th of January, where we'll be joined by Nada Khan, who is a GP in Exeter and NIHR academic clinical lecturer, talking us through her research on continuity of care within general practice. So please head to our website where you can register for the event, and all the seminars, including this one, are recorded, so they'll be available online if you're not able to join live. So that brings us to the end. Thank you so much again, Lewis. It's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you all for joining us tonight, and goodbye.
Thanks, Lucy. Bye, everyone.
Lewis, can you still hear me? You can stay on.